Hello, hello. Welcome to Common Censored. I am Lee Camp here with Eleanor Goldfield.
Hello, hello.
This is the show where we talk censored stories and people, sensible solutions, and common ground movements to fight and build.
And sometimes other shit.
Although this time it will not be other shit. This time it will be the fighting portion, I believe. This stuff is really popping off, as they say, across the country. I know if you're listening to this, you already know that. We're gonna get deep into a lot of this policing. What is it? What are the misconceptions of our U.S. police forces? What they're doing, and what we're seeing across the country right now. Which I don't feel like I really need to go through it because I think it's on every channel there is. There's protests in, I think, over 40 cities now. There's curfews in a lot of cities. The National Guard has been activated in a lot of cities. There are many peaceful protests. There are many protests that involve things that the status quo will call violence, but things like breaking of some windows and burning of some cars. And
Well, I don't know if you want to get into that, but that conversation.
Well, we've had that conversation before on this podcast.
I know, but for those who haven't heard that conversation, property destruction is not violence. Violence is done towards people. Poverty is violence. Withholding health care from people, withholding medicine, withholding housing, that is violence. The cops tear gassing unarmed protesters, that is violence. Pushing and shoving protesters while wearing fucking riot gear is violence. The shooting and the killing of unarmed black folks, that is violence. So smashing a window in a fucking Chase Bank, that is not violence. In fact, that is a very pointed move to a very pointed move to smash a representation of the corporate state.
And that doesn't mean there aren't forms of destruction that can be wrong. Some of them can be wrong. Some of them you can disagree with.
Well,
that's perfectly fine.
Well, here's the thing. It's not about whether you agree or not. It's whether you feel the need to police the tactics that other people use. And no, I don't always agree with it. But a point that needs to be made, however, is that some of the property destruction tactics that we've seen have actually been started by cops. There was some footage that I saw today from Chicago where it was literally just like 4 or 5 bike cops that were smashing a window, and it's like, really? You guys didn't even like try to be incognito about that?
Well, you're jumping ahead on a lot of things I was gonna say, but go ahead.
Sorry. In Minneapolis, there was a guy that whose ex-wife ID'd him as having started to instigate property destruction there. So it is important to recognize that infiltrators and instigators will oftentimes try to start the ball rolling on this kind of action.
And I want to say another note on that is that a friend of ours, Max Blumenthal, who's a well-known journalist, he was at the protest a couple of nights ago and saw a guy get out of a black SUV wearing all black and a mask, and was pretty certain that those are cops. So he then said to the guy, "Are you a cop?" And the guy goes, "No, I'm a journalist." And he goes, "Oh, who are you with?" And he says, "CNN." And then he goes, "Oh, you are? Okay." And then Max turned, he's got this all on video, it's on his Twitter, but he goes back to so he leaves that guy, goes back to the SUV, sees 2 more guys in all black sitting in the SUV. These are behind police lines as well, parked in an area that's been shut down by police. And he says to them, "Are you guys police?" And they say, "No, we're just hanging here." And then he says, "Because your friend who just got out of the car said he's CNN. Are you CNN?" And then they stopped responding and rolled up the window. So you have people in these protests that are cops that often start destruction or instigate things. But anyway.
Yeah, but again, I think it's important that we recognize the distinction between violence and property destruction, and that we not start getting into the weeds of policing other people's tactics and other people's actions in these ways. Of course, something that you've seen on probably a lot of posters is Martin Luther King Jr.'s quote, "The riot is the language of the unheard." And I think that, as folks that are not Black, brown, or indigenous, Lee and I can't really relate directly to what it must feel like, how much anger and how much grief these folks are feeling with the fact that they aren't even allowed to just live. Like, forget thriving; they're not even allowed to survive in this country, and the myriad ways that anger and grief is shown, and folks should not, and as opposed to policing that, we should try to figure out ways to collectively point that anger and that grief in ways that work for us, not just in terms of fighting back, but in terms of building alternatives.
And of course, this was, the hair that broke the camel's back was, or the straw that broke the camel's back was the murder of George Floyd. But that is one small death, and I mean small by the fact that there are 1,000 a year that are like this, of police killings, police killing other people, and this was one that happened to be caught on video, which is when mainstream media will cover it, and then you get people to care more because they can see it with their own eyes. Most of these are not caught on video. If they are caught by the police camera on the front of their chest that some have, they're not going to show it to the public. So it's very rare that the people get to see what goes on. And, in this case, it has created this mass storm, but as you were speaking to, there are many much deeper issues that swell up into this anger and this fury, and that's what we're seeing here. And I wanted to start off by just, we're going to get into a lot of facts and a lot of details about the country and the policing, but I wanted to ask you
let me just circle back on one thing before you ask me something. This is what sorry, I'm a little tired and a little loopy, but I wanted to circle back on one thing about the whole property destruction issue. It's the idea that in this country, property, particularly if it's owned by a big corporation a la Target or CVS or a big bank, is much more important than Black, Brown, and Indigenous lives, really any lives, to be perfectly honest. So that's another reason that these institutions are often targets, because it's highlighting this point that what is there to be served and protected by the cops are these institutions, these brick and mortar buildings that are manifestations of the corporate state. Those are more important than the lives of the people who live here.
Inanimate objects
exactly.
that need guarding more than the actual human beings, which we are seeing are disposable.
Right. So I just wanted to get that little tidbit in there.
Yeah.
I'm sure I'll have more of those throughout.
But and as you said, and as we're going to get into this, there are many racial components, but it's not all racial components. It is really a class war as well, because there are many poor white people who are treated like shit by cops. It's not uncommon. So, there are very strong racial components and very strong components of class as well. But I just wanted to, before we get into the nitty-gritty of various facts and numbers and history, I just wanted to hear what your experience was. You were down at the D.C. protests last night, and I saw a lot of the live stream, and I just wanted to hear what your feeling was being down there.
Yeah, well, first off, I want to kind of piggyback off of what you were just talking about, Lee, which is that this is not just about one man. It's not just about one issue being that Black Lives Matter. That is kind of the spearhead of this moment. But this is last night. I was down by the White House, Lafayette Park, Lafayette Square, whatever, here in D.C., which is the area right in front of the White House. There were people, from every part of, like. And it was incredibly.
Every demographic.
Yeah, I mean, that's the word I was looking for. Woo!
It's
going to be a long podcast.
It's been a long couple days.
But
every geolocational peoples were represented.
I was about to say every color of the rainbow. But it's almost Pride Month, so I'm just feeling kind of queer. No, so it was an incredibly diverse crowd, and what was really powerful was to see how much solidarity there was. And I don't just mean this in terms of, folks showing up. I mean this in like conversations that were being had. I was weaving my way through the crowd, and folks were talking about issues. Folks were talking about the fact that there's a budget hearing tomorrow here in DC about the cops here, whose budget is already $500 million for a city that's roughly 700,000 people, by the way. But people were having conversations about, the connections between indigenous rights and Black Lives Matter. There was an AIM flag from the American Indian movement. People were talking about canceling the rent. People were talking about the lack of health care. So yeah, there's an incredible, which, you mentioned, Lee, this sort of an incredible awareness of the fact that this is all happening under capitalism. And there were several, folks were tagging buildings. One said capitalism is murder. One said capitalism is racism. So there's a very...
And these discussions are being had in front of a phalanx of heavily armed cops.
Oh, yeah. And it was, if DC is very unique because, again, for such a small city of 700,000 people, roughly, we've got dozens of law enforcement agencies. And yesterday there was like a choreography of these fuckers just rotating in and out. There was Park Police because it was Lafayette Park. There's Secret Service because we're right in front of the White House.
I thought the job
there was
of
military
Park
police.
Police was to get the kites out of the tree branches.
I thought so too.
I was
when I first heard the word Park Police when I moved to DC, I was like the people who are friends with Smokey the Bear, those kind of people.
Aren't they the ones that tell you if you're drinking orange juice in the park, you can't have it in a glass container, you got to put it in like a plastic sippy cup or something?
Yes, and that illusion was shattered for me too, Lee. We can commiserate on this, but no, they are just as jacked up in riot gear as anybody else. There was an MRAP there for folks who aren't familiar. That's an armored vehicle that's used in places like Afghanistan, so that you can literally drive over landmines and be fine. And there were helicopters, at least 4 or 5 circling and casting down spotlights on the crowd. Cops were, blocking streets, pushing back protesters, and
firing a lot of tear gas.
Firing a lot of tear gas.
Fuckload of tear gas.
I think me and my friend got tear gas like 4 or 5 times. And
yes, if you want to watch a live stream of this, Jen Deer and Water did a great job, and her Facebook page is called Crushing Colonialism. And although this live stream was last night, you can go watch if you'd like to on Facebook and see what we're talking about. But
yeah, and again, it was just a really fantastic show of solidarity. And I noted this in a post on Facebook. The tear gas canisters had barely hit the ground before you had people rushing to throw them back at the cops, where you had people rushing to make sure that people had water to pour on their eyes and to drink. You had people walking around with water and snacks. I saw a couple of mutual aid folks that were just passing out water, and then people how much is it? And they're like, no, it's free. Just have some fucking water and some snacks.
Right.
Stay hydrated. You had a bunch of Jewish mothers walking around being like, stay hydrated. Make sure you wear your mask. It's so fucking awesome. There were people that didn't even know each other that would run up behind me when I was backing up, and then being like, step up, there's a curb here, step up, I got you. I'd never even seen these people, but they wanted to help and make sure that I wasn't tripping and falling on my ass. So the amount of solidarity out there is incredibly inspiring and incredibly important, because it's important for folks to understand that we're not just out there fighting against something. We're not just out there to say what we're against, anti-fascist, anti-racist. We're there to say what we're for. And what we're for is that kind of active solidarity. It's the literal action of saying, I got you, and then having someone's back, literally. And I fucking tear up just thinking about it, because it is the most beautiful examples of humanity right next to the worst. And it's these sort of clashes of extreme reality that are so powerful, but also so important, because you have that extreme brilliance in these extremely dark moments. And I mean, and this could flow into the conversation about police if you're ready to go there, Lee. But the visual of a bunch of cops who are basically the U.S. police force is founded on the slave patrol, standing in front of a mansion built by slaves, protecting it from basically what's a slave rebellion that never ended, the continuation of the fight for freedom of black and brown folks in this country, not to mention the fight of indigenous folks to just stay alive. That image, it's such a striking image just in terms of like the history like clashing hardcore with the present, and how incredibly heavy that is to feel like you're really living history almost kind of in this like fucking insane loop of history. Like it never ended, and like how heavy that is, but also how again inspiring that is for considering how we can take the exit out of this loop and build something different.
And just real quick before we go more into the history of policing, and later in the episode we will also get into modern day policing, some of the facts that everybody needs to know that will fucking blow your mind. Because every time I like repeat them or re-look them up or think like, wait, wasn't, and I go back and look it up, I'm amazed all over again at some of the stats of how exactly our police system works. But before we get to more history of where U.S. policing came from, I just wanted to establish our current reality one further step, which is there's been a lot of attacks on journalists at these protests. Obviously, a lot of people of all stripes have gotten hurt at these protests. We see people being beaten. We see people getting hit with tear gas and everything else. And by the way, not only is the tear gas fucking dangerous for asthmatics and painful and all this stuff and can take out people's eyes, but on top of that, you have a pandemic and the tear gas is forcing everyone to cough on each other. Yep. So it's really a horror show in multiple ways. And just one more thing to add about tear gas is it's against the Geneva Conventions for countries to use chemical weapons, including tear gas, on each other during war. But our police are allowed to use it on their own civilian population. So this is literally...
during quote-unquote peacetime.
So if this, during peacetime. So if this were a war, this would be a war crime. But instead, as long as you're fucking doing it on unarmed civilians during a peacetime, all good, all great, awesome. Geneva says high five. But back to the journalists, I've seen video online of various journalists getting assaulted in various ways, some hit with rubber bullets. One that I know got her windows shot out of her car, I assume with rubber bullets. Let's hope it wasn't the type of bullets that are meant to be fatal. And then other journalists being arrested. The one that has kind of gone viral is CNN reporter and his cameraman being arrested. And, of course, that's a big deal because CNN's like, we don't understand. We were CNN, and we have our camera, and we have our badge that says CNN, and this never happens to us. It's absolutely terrible for cops to arrest journalists of any stripe, even the stripes of fucking journalists that I hate, like CNN. But this happens nonstop to citizen journalists, to journalists who, I don't even think you should call them citizen because I think they're a step above that. They have an outlet. One of the reporters for Status Quo was knocked down and her phone knocked away. But independent journalists of all stripes are endlessly arrested or shot at. I covered one during Standing Rock who was not only was she clearly a journalist, she's doing an interview. She's alone in that area, so it's not like they missed someone else. Doing an interview, like holding up the microphone to another guy, camera being held behind her, and they shoot her with a rubber bullet, and she collapses to the ground, meaning that the snipers were aiming for the reporters. And we're seeing that again and again. And it just happened this one time to happen to CNN, which makes them make it a big deal, which I like that it's a big deal, but I don't think CNN should fucking act like this doesn't happen all the time. Cops go after journalists. And hilariously on CNN, Don Lemon was, doing his pearl clutching like, oh my God, why aren't people standing up for what's going down out there and stuff like that? And Don Lemon, I remember the video was at Baltimore, at the riots in Baltimore several years ago, and there were independent journalists around him trying to ask him questions and saying, you work for CNN and stuff like that. He pointed the cops at those independent journalists and said, arrest them, they're not real journalists. Like, this is the guy telling cops to harass and arrest other journalists.
Well, and I think it's, there's like a spectrum of press, so to speak. And, we can argue about whether CNN should be called journalists or not. But yeah, so, and it's, folks might be thinking like, well, is it obvious that they're press? And for me, like, it's not necessarily obvious because my press badge is pretty small. And when I'm running around, God knows if it's even turned the right way. But there are people out there that have like legit press helmets that say press on them. Right. And, there's a compilation, if you will, that Vox put out. Granted, they're focusing mostly on corporate media, but it does also say a lot that corporate media has been particularly targeted these past few days, because that really says that there's a desperation on the part of law enforcement that they're being ordered to really go for the corporate media, not just the alternative journalists, but there have been several reports where people are holding up their press badges while they're getting tear gassed or shot at by rubber bullets. They're holding their press badges. They've got a fucking helmet on that says press, and they are being specifically targeted because that. So this is, it's not like they were like, oh, you're just in a crowd of protesters, I couldn't tell. They are absolutely being targeted because they're press. And for folks who are like, I don't understand why, for having been in protest situations and seen typically how corporate media deals with these situations, they don't usually. So I'm thinking, like, the first thing that pops into my mind is the DNC protests in 2016, where CNN would like peek outside the convention and be like, oh, there's a thing going on out there, but Boyz II Men is performing in here, so we can't let that slide.
Or Occupy, where they would drive by, literally stick their camera out the window of the cab and take a photo and keep driving.
Yeah, be like, oh, some homeless people are in Zuccotti Park today. So the fact that basically corporate media hardly ever covers this stuff, and when alternative media get something to go viral, which is a lot harder these days because of suppression of free speech and free press, that it's really dangerous for the ruling class and the powers that be, because people then get to see, holy shit, cops are firing tear gas at people for no fucking reason. They're a cop car, I believe it was in Denver, just ran over a protester or tried to. They get to see with their own eyes that this is what America is. This is what our establishment stands for, and that's really dangerous. And so the idea is, if you can mow down the press, either literally or figuratively, then you get less of those stories out there. And so this is absolutely on purpose. And it's not just alternative media now that's feeling the brunt of the anger of the state for sharing these stories. Yeah,
absolutely. So now I want to go into some of the history of U.S. policing, because you've done a tremendous job of covering this, and I didn't really know some of the reality of where U.S. policing came from. Because here's something else that I want to set this up with, is that and I've said this before on the show, I was a normal Democrat until I was probably early 20s.
Age of reason.
Age of reason, yeah, early 20s. Started to see that we're really stuck inside of this fake two party bullshit, and I also had lived inside of this kind of shell, which was, yes, cops can be assholes, and there are bad police officers out there, and there are some racist police officers out there, and there are some racist policies, yes, but in general, the idea of police is a good one. You have the people that make sure that everybody follows the laws, and isn't that nice? But that is the liberal fantasy of what policing is, and it makes sense because of where our U.S. system of policing came from. And later I'll get into some of the numbers of what policing actually is, but let's start with where policing came from.
Yeah, so
this version of policing.
So I'm not gonna get too into the nerdery on this one, but I can, thanks mostly in part to Christian Williams' book "Our Enemies in Blue," which is a hell of a tome, but it's a fantastic book, and I definitely recommend it to anyone who's interested in learning more about this issue. But basically, the idea is that U.S. policing is descended from slave patrols. And so, as early as the 1780s, Charleston introduced a paramilitary municipal police force in order to control the city's large population of slaves. And folks should realize, first of all, that the ratio of slaves to slave owners was significant. There were a lot more slaves than there were slave owners. So understandably, already in the mid to late 1700s, slave owners were like, we got to get some people with some weaponry to fucking take care of people, so this doesn't
getting kind of nervous. They were outnumbered, and on top of that, you have the fact that the slave rental market became a common thing. So you have, rather than someone that has grown up on that plantation or whatever and been a slave, and the master or whatever, the master family knows them and knows how they behave and what they're dealing with, you now have people that are shipped to somewhere. It's all horrific. I mean, every step of this is just horrifying. But you have people shipped states away, and all of a sudden they're on a plantation they've never been to, an area they've never been to, away from their family. And these masters, or the white people, wanted to know that they would be okay if this new slave rentals they've got were to act up or were to run off. And so some of the earliest slave patrols were just like, hey, we'll have a certain number of people that walk up and down the streets, and if they see a black person, they ask them where they came from and why they're not on their land.
Right, so basically
not their land, the land they're allotted to.
The slave patrol evolved from kind of these like disorganized, rogue, plantation-based vigilantes to an organized force whose job was to have a very like clearly racially focused law enforcement directive. And that's how the police force then grew from that. And some folks might be listening to this be like, well, yeah, but that's fucking history. Well, if you look at the other side of it and say, well, it's just history, black people should get over it because slavery doesn't exist anymore, that's not true. So it's important to note, for instance, that there are more black men in prison today than there were slaves on the plantations back in the day.
Yep.
And that slavery makes up the bulk of our history. If you look at a timeline, the amount of time that slavery took in our history is the majority. It's very recently that that slavery wasn't a part of this country, not to mention the fact that things like Jim Crow, and of course now we have like voting rights blocks and things like that. So the idea that black folks are equal citizens is a fallacy. And the idea then that the slave patrol has evolved to not see race or to not be that racially focused law enforcement is equally a fallacy.
And yeah, absolutely right. And I think the reason the history is important beyond just the racial aspect is that this form of policing, this setup of policing, is designed to entrench the ruling class and make sure that they can, have their way on society. That people in general, whether it be black people or poor people, don't rise up because poor and middle class heavily outnumber the ruling class. And so this system was set up to make sure that those people could maintain their power without fear of a large group of people standing up and demanding more equality, demanding rights, demanding more equality of wealth, like various things. And so it's been passed down from, starting back during those slave patrols. Before that time, in cities, or towns or whatever, little townships, little villages that didn't have a lot of slavery, or, areas around the world, I'm talking, or areas in America, out on some western western like range or something where it's a small family. It was like, you'd have one sheriff or something in the area, and you'd call them if there was a murder or a robbery. Outside of that, you didn't really see the guy. It was like calling the doctor when you're sick. So the patrol thing, where we're going to have people walking or riding horses around to make sure you stay in your place, that was the change. That was the shift.
And that is still the case. I mean, the reality for Black and brown neighborhoods in this country, folks in those neighborhoods oftentimes talk about the cops as an occupying force. It's why the connections between Palestine and Black Lives Matter have been so strong, because there's been a lot of connection in that feeling of having an occupying force in your home. Of course, then there's the fact that the IDF literally does train our cops, but that's a different story. But yeah, I mean, this is a continuation of that history, and so it's important to, and I'm not just saying this as the daughter of a historian, although it does help that I grew up with this perspective. So I get that it's like, it might not be as easy to wrap your head around as it seems for me, because I grew up with this shit. But the idea that the present is the history acting out. It is the history playing out. Like, you wouldn't say that the end of a play is totally different from the beginning. It's just a continuation. And here we are, and we're, it certainly feels like in a lot of ways looking at the end of the American experiment, as, Michael Moore pointed out in a tweet yesterday, which was like a kind of a bizarre, like, really awesome tweet from Michael Moore, where he talked about this being the end of the American experiment. But we have to recognize that the beginning of this play, the beginning of this experiment, is still playing out to today. And we see that if you've ever been to a Black Lives Matter protest and you see the way the cop looks at Black folks, and if you're white and you see the way that cops look at you or hardly even see you, it is stark, and it is impressive in the worst way. And so it's very important that we recognize the history so that we can understand the present and understand what kind of systems we have to tear down, because this is the problem when people talk about reforming the police. How do you reform something that's based on slave patrols? And I want to share this. I shared this quote a while back, but I wanted to share it again. It's from Christian Williams' book, Our Enemies in Blue. And he writes, "The assumption that the police represent a social inevitability ignores the rules of logic. If we accept that police forces arose at a particular point in history to address specific social conditions, i.e. slaves, then it follows that social change could also eliminate the institution. It is a bad habit of mind, a form of power worship, to assume that things must be as they are, that they will continue to be as they have been. It soothes the conscience of the privileged, dulls the will of the oppressed. The first step towards change is the understanding that things can be different. This is my principal recommendation. We must recognize the possibility of a world without police."
Yeah, well put. And so I want to keep going. I want to, in a moment, I'd like to further burst the liberal bubble of what policing is in a second. But I want to take a moment real quick to say Eleanor's movie is finally fucking here. And I want everyone to check it out. It's at hardroadofhope.com. And it's really an incredible movie. And although it is about West Virginia, and I think you will all be able to feel for the plight of many West Virginians, it really speaks to corporate destruction around the country and maybe around the world. I think it's a great snapshot of one state that has it especially rough, but yeah, it really just, the power of corporations to really just run roughshod over everybody's rights and lives and livelihoods is incredible.
Yeah, and it really speaks to, the kind of microcosm that we see in this nation. And I've had a couple of interviews about the film already since the murder of George Floyd. And it's been interesting to have the folks, because the radio show hosts want to make sure that they're staying current. So they'll talk about a current event. And they've kind of asked me to fold those current events into the film and kind of go back and forth on the discussion of these events almost as one commentary. And I've actually found that, unfortunately, that's pretty easy. from a lot of different angles. The sort of oppression, this idea that these people are disposable, that they can just be sacrificed in these corporate sacrifice zones, and who the hell cares? That they're uneducated and stupid, and so why bother trying to help them? And then, of course, there is the race angle, the idea that these poor white communities are really ripe for the infiltration of organizations like the KKK and fascists, white supremacists, because there's a lack of organizing on the left, I feel, as a white organizer, in terms of reaching out to these communities in a way that respects their dignity and their history and their plight. And so there's definitely an important point there about the importance of leftists. And actually, organizations like Antifa have done a great job of reaching out to poor white communities, creating kind of the John Brown Gun Club. John Brown, for those of you who don't know, was an abolitionist. The Huey P. Newton Gun Club, Redneck Revolt is another gun club that's organized by white folks for fellow poor white folks. So the importance of doing this outreach to these poor white communities and saying, hey, your history is a radical one. Your history includes marching next to black folks and recognizing your shared but different oppression,
Right.
And fighting against the architects of that oppression. And so really, while this film isn't obviously about what's happening right now, it is in a lot of ways, because the history of West Virginia is in so many ways the history of the U.S.
Yeah.
And again, what we see playing out on the streets right now is a continuation of U.S. history.
So, highly recommend everybody check it out, and please help us share it, help us get it out there. It's at hardroadofhope.com. Thank you all, for those of you who've joined the Patreon recently. We recently got we finally jumped the line of 200 subscribers.
Thank you.
So thank you guys so much. It's so incredible, and you get the extra content every week. Patreon.com/commoncensored. And we've been doing a live stream, free live stream for anyone to watch. We try and do it every week, and that is only at youtube.com/momentofclarity. Although it is free to attend, we also try and raise money for a cause each week. This week we raised, I'm guessing, I haven't looked up the actual numbers, but I'm guessing close to $400 for Appalachians Against Pipelines. And last week we raised close to $500 for mutual aid. So that's every week at youtube.com/momentofclarity. Let's see. My book, which definitely talks a lot about policing, is at leecampbook.com.
And it's amazing.
My free stand-up comedy special, which has a long bit on policing, is at leecampamerican.com. You can watch it for free. And all of Eleanor's stuff is at artkillingapathy.com. Okay, let's keep going here. And I want to spend a minute. Let's see. I want to skip ahead and spend a minute deconstructing this liberal myth of how policing works. Most people think that, and I plan to talk about this on a future Redacted tonight, but it might be a couple of weeks. But a lot of people think that police, that their job, the average cop standing around, their job and what they do is they get a call on their radio, and this is what we see on TV, right? This is what we see on SVU, with various Law and Order, CSI, all that shit. They get a call on the radio or whatever, and they say, oh my God, gunman at such and such, go get him. Or robbery went on here, go get the guy. Or, it's all this crazy shit that's going down. Current rape happening in alley, and they go rushing in, all right? And
It's kind of like the bat signal.
And they get there and they stop the bad guy. The truth is, and this another great book, much quicker read than Our Enemies in Blue. Well, you said it's a big tome, Enemies in Blue.
I know, but it's
Alex,
worth it.
No, the book I read is better than the book you read. Alex,
I'll fight you, and my book's bigger, so I'll win.
Professor Alex Vitale has a book called The End of Policing, and in that he talks about, and I'd never heard this spoken about anywhere. He talks about how the average cop makes one felony arrest a year.
Pray tell, what is a felony? Lee?
one a year. A felony is a more significant crime, right? Misdemeanor is these tiny crimes, having a little bit of pot on you, or a driving violation that you didn't pay.
So a felony is like legit, you killed someone.
But yeah, misdemeanor is the thing that it really won't interrupt your life. You don't normally go to prison for a misdemeanor. Felony is something larger. It is, drug dealing that they consider a felony, or killing someone, or stuff like that. So the average cop makes one of those arrests a year, and the rest of the time, so 99% or 99.9% or whatever of their time, is standing around and harassing people, largely people of color, but harassing people and trying to find something that they can call a crime to arrest someone for. So this is stuff like loitering or causing a disturbance is one they're very fond of.
Because
so
it's fittingly vague.
A guy's drunk. He goes into a store. He ends up in a verbal argument with the CVS clerk. They call the cops. He ends up arguing with the cops, and they arrest him for causing a disturbance. It's that kind of shit. It very vague, and then it's sometimes a resisting arrest, and then they'll often get rid of the initial charge because it was horseshit to begin with, and just charge someone with a resisting arrest. Well, resisting arrest from what? If there's no initial charge, it doesn't make any sense. Of course you resisted arrest if there's no initial charge. We're just arresting you for the fuck of it.
Yep.
So anyway, the point is, very much of most of what every cop does is kind of nothing but insert themselves in people's lives and create harassment. Mm-hmm. Now, for those larger crimes that the ones we see on TV that we all think, oh, thank goodness our cops are there to stop the killer when he's running down the alley with the knife and that bloodthirsty look in his eyes. Even those, so this is a quote from Alex Vitale's book, even detectives, who are only 15% of the police forces, detectives are the ones looking into the big crimes, even detectives spend most of their time taking reports of crimes that they will never solve. And in many cases, will never even investigate. Because, as some people know from TV now, if you don't solve it in the first 24 hours or something, because someone didn't say, it was my roommate stole the stuff, if you don't get that kind of thing in the opening 24 hours, or 48 hours, you're probably not going to get it. Because it's not that easy to solve a crime when it's not something obvious. Right. So to continue with the quote, there is no possible way for police to investigate every reported crime. Even homicide investigations can be brought to a quick conclusion with no clear suspect if they don't identify one quickly within the first 2 days. Burglaries and larcenies are even less likely to be investigated thoroughly, if at all. Most crimes that are investigated are not solved. And I think I read recently, although in a separate text, a separate article, that only 40% of murders are even solved. So most of what cops are doing is failing to solve the big crimes, and the average cop runs around with arresting people, putting them in the system for nothing crimes. A common one in New York, which we've talked about on the podcast before, is having an open beverage. They'll just grab a guy for having an open beverage on the streets, throw him in jail. It's really just about putting people getting them, quote unquote, in the system. So then you can arrest them more easily later. Mm-hmm. You can check their license plate if they're driving down the road, see, he has 2 priors, and pull him over.
You can also add more jail time, the more arrests that you have.
Yep.
And there's it was the Divide by Matt Taibbi, where he writes about somebody going to jail for blocking a sidewalk.
In front of his own
right.
apartment.
I believe this was Bedford-Stuyvesant in New York. But I mean, these are the kind, and so like there's a reason to get in the system, because then they can keep bringing you back into the system, and that's why, if you look at the trajectory here, cops are predominantly in black and brown neighborhoods. Most of the people in prison are black and brown people. Why? Because once you're in the system, you just keep coming back, because the cops are always there to watch everything that you fucking do.
As Michael Bloomberg famously said in the leaked audio recording, well, we put the cops there because that's where all the crime is. And my point on Redacted is that where all the corporate crime is?
I think you meant Wall Street.
Is that were the Boeing executives who decided to keep flying planes that they knew were going to crash into the ground? Did they do that in the projects? Did they go have a meeting in Bed-Stuy about...
Right, and that's the when people talk about looting, which is it irritates me to no end when people are like, but what about the looting? Well, let's talk about this. First of all, people didn't call it looting when land was stolen from indigenous peoples in the so-called now United States. They didn't call it looting when they steal your wages, when they steal your health care, when something like almost 500, I'm trying to see the exact tweet right now, but something like $500 billion has been stolen. Oh, American billionaires got $434 billion richer during the pandemic.
How about the
is
looting?
fucking looting.
How about the looting in your movie of mineral rights?
Exactly. The looting of, mineral versus surface rights of the coal industry, or just like the fact that coal companies aren't paying out pensions and they're stealing people's health care. That is fucking looting.
Right. It's looting on a far larger scale than any stealing of diapers at Target.
And by the way, I will also reiterate that if you're stealing to survive, that's not stealing. That's called surviving. And the bigger question, the real question there is, why do you have to steal to survive? And I think, I can't remember which country, it was Italy that like a few years ago made it a law that if you're stealing because you're hungry, then it's not considered theft.
They didn't,
duh.
a small correction. They didn't actually make it a law. They let a guy off because he was homeless, he stole food, they arrested him, and then he went all the way through the courts and had, I believe, a trial. And the judge decided he was hungry, therefore it's not a crime. Which
is really just saying a lot, that he even had to go through the whole fucking system just to say, I was hungry, I didn't want to starve to death. But of course, in the U.S., just fucking starve to death. Stop being so selfish.
just stop being selfish and starve to death. For the you no good, Nick. So to sum up here, what Alex Vitale was saying about, what police really do, what most of their job really is. He says, the reality is that the police exist primarily as a system for managing and even producing inequality by suppressing social movements like we're seeing with these protests and I added that part, and tightly managing the behaviors of poor and non-white people, those on the losing end of economic and political arrangements. So really, what your average police do most of the day is just enforce a form of an economic stranglehold against a lot of peoples, and a class stranglehold and a race stranglehold of our system. And it is not what you see on television. It is not the stopping of the big crimes. Yes, they stop some crimes, but here's my view of how policing would work. You would get rid of all these police that are just wandering around, inserting themselves into people's lives, and you would only literally have a tiny police force for literally like a mass shooter just won't stop killing everybody.
And I'm more of the just fucking etch-a-sketch it. Don't try to save it. Abolish the police and start with something fresh that isn't based on slave patrol.
Well, fair enough, but we I think there's a lot of room for compromise in between those two, or a lot of similarities. But in terms of to go back to the fact that it's now like mainly enforcing these tiny laws that have all been created in the past, few decades. He also says in his book how we have more laws, because there's new laws added every year. We can increase the number of laws of how you're going to behave perfectly in society, and it results in an astronomical level of incarceration. And one of the biggest ones, obviously, is this drug war, which is a war on our own people. But that added all these laws and all these mandatory minimums for having a little bit of cocaine on you, or having, for a long time, in a lot of states still, having weed on you, and all these things that should be, some of the harder drugs could be a health issue, but there's no reason it should be a crime issue. There's no reason someone should be kept in a cage for the next 30 years of their life because they were shooting heroin. It's absolutely fucking nonsensical, but it is a way to fucking put them in the system and enforce this status quo system of the rich, ownership of society.
Right, and it circles back to I can't remember, was it I can't remember her name. She's a filmmaker who did the film about the 13th Amendment. and how the exception, to ending slavery, the fact that it still exists when you commit a crime, really supports the concept that slavery never ended, because it's still very much a part of the prison industrial complex. And of course, most of the people in prison are black and brown folks. So, yeah. So yeah, it's
and a lot of these laws that have been added, it's like a quarter of cities across the country have begging restrictions. 33% have loitering bans. Over 50% prohibit sitting or lying down in areas. Some have bans on sleeping in your car. Some have bans on sleeping in public at all. So someone's asleep on a bench. It's basically illegal to be homeless or even, poor and not have a regular house. Like, it's just a way to keep arresting people.
But of course, if you're if you're like a hedge fund guy who wanted to take a nap after his cocaine bender on a bench in some park in downtown Manhattan, no one's gonna fucking bother you.
Or if they do, they'd say, "Could you move it along?" They're not going to give you a ticket. They're not going to arrest
they'd say
you.
Anything at all. But I mean, point being, but this is the other thing, and this is something that it shouldn't fucking matter, but this really speaks to how superfluous the laws are. It's just really about control and oppression and killing black and brown folks predominantly. George Floyd complied with everything that the cops told him to do. And this is not an unusual story. You've seen this in a lot, like I believe Sandra Bland complied with everything. There's stories upon stories upon stories of black and brown folks complying with everything the cops are fucking telling them to do and still are murdered. And so this is another point. It's like, well, we follow these bullshit laws that you give us and we die anyway. So then what are we supposed to do? Well, basically the only thing left to do is to rebel, because there's no sense in the laws, as as Lee and I have already mentioned. And even if we try to follow these nonsense laws and we try to respect this bullshit authority of the slave patrol, we still the black and brown folks are still being murdered. So there's no way out of it. And this also speaks to the whole, like, well, you shouldn't be out in the streets protesting. It's like, well, you didn't fucking like it when people took a knee. You didn't fucking like it when people were calling their members of Congress or petitioning or doing the more quiet and respectful protests. Right. It really harkens back to Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail, where he wrote that, that's what's more dangerous than the KKK is the well-meaning white liberal that's like, yeah, no, I want you to have freedom. It's just really inconvenient for me right now. So if you could, like, and I'm paraphrasing because he was way more eloquent than I am, but he's like, if you could just wait until it's like more convenient for me. And of course, this is, his other line, like, justice deferred is justice denied. There is no more convenient time to fight for your freedom or fight for justice. And that's why these sort of like well-meaning people, not even well-meaning people, the fucking like comfortable liberals that just sit back and like, I don't agree with what you're doing, but of course I'm not racist.
Well, I will say that I agree with almost all that. I didn't like the taking a knee because I like my traumatic brain injuries uninterrupted, okay? I pay good money for the cable network to see that, and I really don't like a pause beforehand. So if you could just move it along and beat the shit out of each other, that would be really great.
That would be better for me.
A few more things I want to tell you about policing for those of you who are curious of what goes on with your average police officer. Some of you might know this, some of you might not, but police officers are not trained well. In most cities across America, your average hairdresser or beautician or whatever the term is gets 2 to 10 times as much training. Not gets, but is required by law to have a lot more training than your average cop. That's in most states. Here's one example. The minimum training requirement for Michigan police officers is 594 hours to become a police officer. To work with electrical signs, you need 4,000 hours of experience. 594 hours to shoot and kill people and be basically completely free of any consequences. 4,000 hours to fix electrical signs. It's so fucking incredible. The difference of training, the average hairdresser needs a lot more training than your average cop. And I've talked on this show before about also the training in gun use of the gun. Many, the old number was 58 hours. If you average out all the police departments across the country, 58 hours of gun training. But if you include gun and use of force, so other forms of use of force, it's 100 hours. 100 hours of, various use of force versus like 8 to 10 hours of any form of de-escalation. So basically, these cops who don't get enough training to begin with are then trained a lot on how to kill or harm people, very little on how to walk into a situation and not kill or harm people. Like, that is not their number one goal. Their goal is they walk into these situations, or at least maybe in their head they're not thinking it's their goal, but it's the thing they're prepped for and they're most likely to do, is cause harm and pain, and if you're lucky, just arrest without killing someone. And the estimates are that 50% of all the killings, which are over 1,000 a year in America, of police killing people, the estimate is that 50% of those are mentally ill people, or at least mentally troubled people. And that makes sense because cops come into a situation, often within the first couple of seconds, they yell commands at the person. If the person does not abide or doesn't understand or is a little out of it, or even if it's just very drunk, they often will not perfectly abide by these commands. Put your hands behind your back, get on your knees, don't look at us, put one hand in your pocket to get your wallet, but don't do it quickly. Like, all these crazy commands. And then often, if it's a scared cop or just a cop who fucking enjoys shooting his gun, they will shoot the person for not abiding by these commands correctly. In George Floyd's case, he was doing everything correctly, but many cases, this is someone who's very out of it. I have a friend, or maybe more than one friend, that has bipolar, and it has episodes where they couldn't abide by commands if you asked them to. If you said sit still and listen to me for a minute, you're not gonna get that. Yeah. And so now and they have a tendency to cause problems out in public because they talk to people in weird ways. They approach people that don't want to be approached. So cops get called almost always, and these cops walk into it and they ask the person to do something, and the person often will not do what they are being asked.
Yeah, and I remember a story from a few years ago in North Carolina, which is where I'm from. The cops shot a deaf man who was trying to sign to them. They told him to get his hands up, and he was trying to sign to them that he's deaf, and they shot him. This is the kind, as opposed to. And I'm not saying that all cops should have to fucking know sign language, but you shouldn't shoot someone because you don't know sign language. That is not how you deal with that situation. But that's how they deal with that. Imagine walking into a place and somebody's speaking a different language and you shoot them for it. And this is like the initial response. And so in terms of alternatives, some folks are like, well, if you don't want cops, what do you want? Which is always how that question sounds to me. I'm sorry for adopting that voice, but that's always how that question sounds.
Many of them do have that voice.
But so I'll give you an example, and some folks will use examples like Rojava or things like that, but I'll give you one that's in the United States. So there's the White Bird Clinic.
I thought you were going to say the Toy Patrol at Toys R Us, because
I didn't know that was a thing.
I just made it up, but it sounds pretty awesome. the Vomit Patrol at Chuck E. Cheese. Do you want it to be like that?
Yes. Only if you get to projectile vomit on cops. But. So in Eugene, Oregon, decades ago, the White Bird Clinic started as a way to deal with folks that were having drug issues and that were either homeless or in a transient position, and they wanted a way to help their community members without having to involve the cops. And then this became basically a template. And now Eugene, Oregon, the White Bird Clinic is like an official, and we can have conversations about whether things should be official, but there's a plus to this. They are actually part of the dispatch. So if you call 911 and it's like a mental health issue, like you call someone and you say, hey, this guy is acting weird by a bus stop. Okay, well, that doesn't sound very dangerous. Let's deploy. And so the folks that are part of this clinic are there's a social worker and somebody who's well versed with mental health and EMT issues. So like if there is a physical wound, they can deal with that as well.
And a hot stone masseuse goes as well, just in case.
And a lute player, because it's the calming.
I would love that.
The calming power of music.
And one of the animal therapy people. He's got like a cat you can pet.
But Lee, don't make fun of it.
Sorry,
it's actually really important.
Sorry.
So no, there's no fucking lute player. But the idea is that they deploy people who and I interviewed a member of the Whitebird Clinic on my show previously, and he talked about this. He was like, we don't have uniforms. We show up in like jeans and a t-shirt, and that's very purposeful because a lot of these people who have who act who have mental health issues and are either homeless or acting quote unquote erratically have already had run-ins with cops. So they see a uniform and they freak the fuck out and they start acting more erratically. I wonder why. So they purposely dress like kind of whatever. And instead of walking up there with guns and everything like that, they just walk up and be like, hey, how are you feeling?
Right.
Like, we gotta,
right.
We heard that you weren't feeling well, or, like, is there a problem? Like, is somebody bothering you, or is something going on? Like, do you need help? Are you scared? And they address it that fucking way. And so then, this is a way of trying to make this transition away from police and bringing in mental health workers who are not trained with guns, but are trained with human beings.
Right. And this goes for 90% of what cops do, and I have a joke about this in my stand-up act, but I'm gonna tell it without the joke part. That if you want these things going on in your society, you really want to have a ban on loitering, which I don't think there should be a fucking law against that. Someone wants to fucking stand somewhere in public, let them goddamn stand there. But let's say all our society comes around, I'm for democracy, and they all decide we want a ban on loitering, then you have a fucking loiter patrol that doesn't have a gun, isn't allowed to use a gun, isn't allowed to kill people, can't arrest people, but give them little loitering tickets. You could replace 99% of what police do with a person who doesn't have a gun and is not like trained to possibly kill people. Like, and that could be most of your society. And in fact, in a lot of countries, that is the deal, that most of these cops that are around are not armed and are not trained to kill people. And so anybody who acts like our system is all that could be, it's got some flaws, but this is the only way to do it. Horseshit. Other countries have found other ways to do it. The average number of police killings, people that police kill in Germany, which is smaller than the U.S., but their average number is 3 a year, okay? And they go some years with 0. And yes, Germany's smaller than the U.S., but it's not 0 smaller. You fucking assholes. And in the UK, the average is like 7. It's very rare for police to kill people in other countries. Here, it's literally a daily occurrence.
Well, and also, since you mentioned Germany and the UK, shout out to Berlin and London, where folks, like thousands of people in the UK, protested outside the U.S. embassies in Berlin and London because of what's going on in the U.S. So that kind of international solidarity is fucking awesome and so appreciated and definitely seen and recognized. So super shout out to folks there. But again, going back to your point, Lee, it again, like as I noted earlier in the quote by Christian Williams, to think that things are the way that they are because that's the way they've always been. First of all, that's just intellectually fucking lazy. Not just intellectually lazy, it's imaginatively lazy. But it also, again, it soothes the conscience of the privileged and dulls the will of the oppressed. And so if you're in a place of privilege, you'd be like, well, I can't do anything to change anything. I can't use my privilege to dismantle this system because this is just how it is. It's how it's always been. But of course, that's bullshit because, and I used this example recently too. ICE is a recent fucking like they're recent. Thank you, creation. They didn't exist. Like in my lifetime, they didn't exist. Like that's how fucking recent they are. Like 2001 or something. Like they're fucking recent. Yeah. So the idea that these institutions have always been there, they just have to continue being there, that's fucking wrong, and it's stupid and it's dangerous.
And so I'd kind of like to sum up with the fact that you should not call the cops or invite them into your lives or someone else's life unless you literally just had someone like killed or you have a gunman on you and it's like a thing of true last resort. Because you are inviting in people that are not well trained, which we've just established by the number of hours, that are sometimes scared, that are heavily armed, and that are relatively unstable. Because you have a system in which the people that want to sign up for to be police are often overly aggressive. They're 25% or the average are abusing steroids, which make one of the side effects is making rash decisions, poor decision making, and quick to anger. And many of them used to be soldiers. They have PTSD and that they haven't dealt with. So there's many problems with police that I'd love for them to get help with, but I don't think they're going to. And so you're inviting all of that and unaccountable with completely unaccountable people with guns into your situation. The number of, and I'm not going to go through the stories here, but the number of people who call the cops and then they or one of their fellow family members gets shot is very high. We could sit here for the next 15 minutes listing off people who called the cops to get help for themselves. One example that I just read in I believe Alex Vitale's book is a mother who called because her mentally challenged kid wouldn't take his pills. So she called the cops because she thought they were going to tell him to take his pills or make him take his pills. Instead, they showed up. He walked out of the house holding a screwdriver, who knows why, and they shot and killed him. Like, that's what you're inviting into your life. It is a terrible idea.
Yeah, and I'd also, as we're wrapping up here, just make the point that I totally understand that there are times when you feel like you have no other option. A friend of mine a few years ago was raped and her rapist refused to leave her apartment and she had no choice but to call the cops. And this also speaks to the need to build up alternatives to calling the police, like Whitebird Clinic or and I would argue that you never need to call the police if there are things like what they have in Rojava, which is like peacekeeping units because I think the problem with the police is that sort of calcified hierarchy and that calcified power structure where the cops always know that they are going to be on top. But what they do in Rojava is that they have rotating peace groups. So basically like peacekeepers. So basically you have that role for 6 months in your neighborhood, in your community.
So the power can't go to your head as much.
If you decide to be a dick, then 6 months later, somebody else is going to have that over you.
Right.
And you're always responding to people you're responding to your neighbors. So there's that sense of community like, hey, Bill is going to come check on me. I know Bill, and I'm not going to be freaked out because I know his voice. If you have mental health issues, like just having like that familiar voice, that familiar face is super helpful. So there are so many ways of doing this that really speak to the needs and the human rights of the people in our community that have nothing to do with people with guns, that have nothing to do with this calcified structure of power and hierarchy. And so I think it's really important that we not only recognize that some of our friends and family will be put in those positions where they feel they can't do anything but call the cops, and because of that, recognize that we really have to build alternatives in our communities. And you don't have to start big. You can start these like peacekeeping groups already. So I think it's like, let's think creatively about how we can address this issue and then start implementing that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you guys so much for listening. We're going to head over to patreon.com/commoncensored and do a little extra content. We would love to hang out with you on our live stream. We answer your questions. For those of you who haven't joined us before, we answer your questions. We talk about your topics. It's really a fun time. And it's at youtube.com/moment of clarity. I always try and send out emails and tweets about when we're going to be doing it. It's usually either Friday or Sunday. So keep an eye out for those. If you aren't signed up for our email list, you can text the word redacted. I can't remember the other one, so I'm going to give you the redacted one. But you can text the word redacted.
Censored, right?
Well, yeah, but I can't remember the number.
Oh.
I think the number's
mind.
I think the number's the same. Anyway, let's just go with redacted. Redacted to 33777. That'll get you signed up to our free email list. But most importantly, I already said patreon.com/commoncensored. Thank you guys for that. But most importantly, go see Eleanor's movie. It's out now. It's her first full-length, hour-long documentary, and it's at hardroadofhope.com. We'd love to hear what you think of it. We'd love for you to share it with friends. And, that's what I got.
Thank you. That was awesome.
Keep fighting.
Act out.